I never thought I'd spend Christmas Eve driving through a blizzard to a house I swore I'd never set foot in again. But there I was, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my breath fogging up the windshield, and my heart pounding louder than the snowstorm outside. The call had come an hour ago, and I'd barely had time to grab my coat before I was on the road. It was my younger sister, Ashley, who'd called. Her voice trembled on the other end of the line, and I immediately knew something was wrong. "Mom's sick, Claire," she said, her words like a punch to the gut. "The doctor thinks it's serious. You need to come home." Home. That word tasted bitter in my mouth. I hadn't been back to our small-town Wisconsin farmhouse since the day I packed my bags at 22, swearing I'd never return. My mother and I had fought viciously that day, her accusations ringing in my ears. "You're selfish, Claire. Always thinking about yourself. Don't you care about this family?" I'd slammed the door on her words and on my childhood, convinced I'd never look back. But now, 10 years later, I was speeding toward the very place I'd escaped, because no matter how much time had passed, and no matter how complicated our relationship was, I still loved her. She was my mom. The house came into view, its familiar silhouette blanketed in snow, warm light spilling from the windows. I parked and sat there for a moment, letting memories wash over me. Christmases spent decorating that porch with Dad before he passed. Summers chasing fireflies with Ashley in the yard. And then, of course, the darker memories, the fights, the cold silences, the lingering resentment. I stepped inside, and the warmth hit me like a wave. The smell of pine and freshly baked cookies filled the air, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like nothing had changed. But then I saw her. Mom was sitting in her recliner by the fireplace, a blanket draped over her legs. She looked so small, so frail. Her once vibrant auburn hair was streaked with gray, and her cheeks, always flushed with color, were pale. When she looked up and saw me, her eyes filled with tears. "Claire," she said softly, her voice cracking. "You came." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Of course I did." Ashley appeared from the kitchen, her face a mixture of relief and worry. "Hey," she said, hugging me tightly. "She's been asking for you all day." I spent the evening sitting beside Mom, listening to her talk about mundane things like the weather and Ashley's new job at the local library. It was awkward at first, stilted and tense, but as the night went on, something shifted. She laughed at one of my sarcastic comments, and for a moment, it felt like we were back to the way we used to be before everything fell apart. After Ashley went to bed, Mom reached for my hand. "Claire," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to tell you something." My stomach nodded. I'd always known there were secrets in our family, unspoken things buried beneath the surface. "What is it?" I asked cautiously. Her grip tightened. "It's about your father." I froze. Dad had died when I was 16, and while we'd all mourned him deeply, I'd never questioned the circumstances of his death. He'd had a heart attack while driving home from work. That's what we were told. That's what I'd believed. But now, as Mom looked at me with tears streaming down her face, I knew there was more to the story. "He didn't die the way we told you," she confessed. "It wasn't a heart attack. It was an accident. He was on his way to see someone. A woman." The words hung in the air like a bombshell. I felt the room spin around me. "What?" I whispered. "Are you saying he was cheating on you?" She nodded slowly, her face crumpling with grief. "I found out a week before he died. I confronted him, and he swore it was over. But that night, he was going to see her, Claire. And he never came back." I pulled my hand away, anger and confusion bubbling inside me. "Why are you telling me this now? After all these years?" "Because I don't want to take it to my grave," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't want to carry this secret anymore. I'm so sorry, Claire. I thought I was protecting you and Ashley, but maybe I was just protecting myself." I didn't know what to say. My memories of Dad, this perfect, loving man, were shattered in an instant. And yet, as I looked at Mom, broken and vulnerable, I realized she'd been carrying this burden alone for so long. It had eaten away at her, poisoned her from the inside. I need time to process this, I said finally, standing up. I'm going to bed. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. By morning, the anger had dulled, replaced by a strange sense of clarity. I didn't condone what Dad had done, and I didn't entirely forgive Mom for keeping it from us. But I also understood something I hadn't before: families are messy. People make mistakes. And sometimes, the best you can do is try to move forward. When I went downstairs, Mom was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea. I sat across from her and took a deep breath. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you, I said. But I'm willing to try. Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time, there was a flicker of hope in them. Thank you, Claire. That Christmas, we didn't exchange many gifts. But in a way, we gave each other something far more meaningful, a chance to start over. And as we sat by the fire that night, laughing over stories of our childhood, I realized that maybe, just maybe, coming home wasn't such a bad thing after all. The days following Christmas were a strange mix of emotional highs and lows. Mom's health seemed to stabilize, though her energy was still fragile. Ashley and I took turns looking after her, and for the first time in years, the three of us were spending meaningful time together. It wasn't perfect, there were moments of tension and awkward silences, but there was also laughter and tentative hope. On the second night after Christmas, as I was sorting through some old boxes in the attic, I stumbled across something unexpected, a small, leather-bound journal tucked away beneath a pile of Dad's things. My breath caught in my throat as I opened it, the pages filled with his familiar handwriting. I sat down on the dusty wooden floor, the cold seeping through my jeans, and began to read. At first, the entries were mundane work notes, reminders, lists of errands. But as I flipped further, I found a series of letters addressed to M. My heart pounded as I realized who they were meant for, the woman he'd been seeing before he died. The letters were raw and emotional, filled with regret and longing. He wrote about feeling trapped in his marriage, about wanting something different but not knowing how to get it. And then, in one of the last entries, he wrote something that made my chest tighten. I love my daughters more than anything. I've made so many mistakes, but if there's one thing I want them to know, it's that none of this is their fault. I hope someday they'll understand. I closed the journal and sat there in the dim light, tears streaming down my face. It was so much to process, too much. My image of Dad, the man I'd put on a pedestal for so long, was crumbling. But at the same time, I felt an odd sense of connection to him. He'd been flawed, yes, but he'd been human. The next morning, I showed the journal to Mom. Her face went pale as she flipped through the pages, her hands trembling. I didn't know he wrote these, she whispered. I thought I knew everything. Do you want me to throw it away? I asked, unsure of what else to do. Part of me wanted to burn it, to erase this painful chapter of our family history. But Mom shook her head. No, she said firmly. I think we need to keep it. Maybe not now, but someday, Ashley should read it too. She deserves to know the truth. Later that evening, Ashley joined me on the porch. The snow had stopped, and the stars were out, bright and piercing against the inky sky. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and looked at me, her expression curious. What's been going on with you and Mom? You've both been weird. I hesitated, unsure how much to tell her. But in the end, I decided she had a right to know. I told her everything, about the truth behind Dad's death, about the journal, about Mom's confession. Ashley was quiet for a long time after I finished. She stared out at the snow-covered yard, her breath visible in the freezing air. I don't know what to feel, she admitted finally. I'm angry, but I'm also sad. It's like we've been living in this bubble of lies, and now it's all just gone. I know, I said softly. But maybe this is a chance for us to build something new. Something real. She nodded, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of determination in her eyes. I think you're right. But it's going to take time. Over the next week, as New Year's approached, we began the slow process of healing. Mom, Ashley, and I talked more openly than we ever had before, sharing our fears, our regrets, and even our hopes for the future. It wasn't easy, there were still moments of frustration and hurt, but we were trying, and that was what mattered. On New Year's Eve, we decided to stay in and celebrate together. We made a feast of Mom's favorite recipes, played old board games, and even dug out the photo albums from the basement. As the clock struck midnight, we toasted with glasses of sparkling cider, laughing and crying at the same time. I'm proud of us, Ashley said, raising her glass. We've been through a lot, but we're still here. Mom smiled, her eyes shining with tears. You girls are my everything. I'm so sorry for the mistakes I've made, but I promise I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. We hugged, the three of us wrapped in a tight embrace, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. The wounds of the past would never fully disappear, but they didn't have to define us. We were a family, messy, imperfect, and broken in places, but still a family. And that was enough. As I stood on the porch later that night, watching the snow fall softly under the moonlight, I realized something. Coming home hadn't just been about Mom or Dad. It had been about me. About finding closure, about letting go of old grudges, and about learning how to forgive, not just others, but myself too. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to move forward. The new year brought a strange kind of calm, the kind that feels like the eye of a storm. I stayed at the farmhouse longer than I had planned, partly because Mom's health was still precarious, but also because I felt like there was unfinished business, not just with her, but with myself. Ashley and I fell into a comfortable rhythm, splitting chores and spending our evenings talking about everything we'd never said before. We talked about Dad's affair, about how it felt to grow up in a house that sometimes felt like a war zone. She told me how lonely she'd felt after I left, how she resented me for leaving her to deal with Mom's anger on her own. I told her how guilty I'd felt all those years, how I'd convinced myself that cutting ties was the only way to survive. It wasn't easy, but with every late-night conversation, the cracks in our relationship began to mend. By the end of January, I started to feel like I'd rediscovered not just my sister, but my best friend. But then, just as things were starting to feel normal again, the storm came back. It was a Sunday afternoon when the knock came at the door. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, while Ashley was upstairs helping Mom sort through old clothes. When I opened the door, I froze. A man stood there, bundled in a heavy coat and scarf, but I could still see the sharp angles of his face, the piercing blue eyes. He looked to be in his late 40s, and there was something about him that felt familiar. Too familiar. Claire, he asked, his voice hesitant. Who are you? I demanded, my heart racing. He hesitated, his hand gripping the edge of the doorframe as if he needed the support. My name is Peter. I was a friend of your father's. My stomach dropped. A friend? Or the friend? The one my dad had been seeing before he died? I stepped back, suddenly unsure if I wanted to slam the door in his face or invite him in. I know this is unexpected, he said quickly, sensing my hesitation. But I've been carrying something for years, and I need to set it right. Please, just hear me out. Against my better judgment, I let him in. We sat at the kitchen table, and I offered him a cup of coffee, though my hands were shaking so badly I nearly spilled it. He took a sip, his eyes scanning the room like he was searching for ghosts. I'm sorry to come here like this, he said finally. But I've been thinking about your father a lot lately. About what happened? What do you mean, what happened? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Peter sighed, setting the mug down. Your dad and I, we were close. Closer than most people realized. He paused, his eyes meeting mine, and I understood what he was trying to say. You were together? I whispered, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. He nodded. We loved each other. For years, we tried to deny it, to pretend it wasn't real. But it was. And just when we were finally ready to be honest about it, he died. My mind raced, trying to process this new version of my father, a version I had never known. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, my voice trembling. Why not just let it stay buried? Because it shouldn't be buried, Peter said, his voice firm. Your dad was a good man, Claire. He loved you and Ashley more than anything. And he loved your mom too, in his own way. But he was torn. He didn't know how to live the life he wanted without hurting the people he cared about. I sat back, my thoughts swirling. All these years, I'd believed Dad's affair was with another woman. But now, everything I thought I knew had been turned upside down. I felt anger, confusion, even a strange sense of relief. It was like finding a missing piece of a puzzle, even if the picture it revealed wasn't what I'd expected. What do you want from us? I asked finally. Nothing, Peter said softly. I don't want anything. I just needed to tell you the truth. To give you a chance to understand him, not as the man you thought he was, but as the man he truly was. We sat in silence for a long time after that. Finally, I nodded. Thank you for telling me. Peter stood, his movements hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he should stay or go. For what it's worth, he said, his voice thick with emotion, your dad was proud of you. He talked about you all the time. He wanted so badly for you to be happy. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table for what felt like hours, replaying the conversation in my mind. When Ashley and Mom came downstairs, I told them everything. Mom's face crumpled with grief, but she didn't seem surprised. Ashley, on the other hand, was stunned. So Dad was, she began, but couldn't finish the sentence. Yes, I said simply. He was. We spent the rest of the evening talking, unpacking this new layer of our family's history. It was painful, but it also felt strangely freeing. For so long, we'd been living with half-truths and buried secrets. Now, for the first time, we were seeing the whole picture. In the weeks that followed, I started to notice small changes. Mom seemed lighter, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Ashley and I grew even closer, bonding over the shared complexity of our family's story. And as for me, I found myself thinking about Dad not with anger or disappointment, but with a deeper understanding of his humanity. The farmhouse, once a place I had avoided at all costs, began to feel like home again. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. And as winter melted into spring, I realized that our family, broken and messy as it was still worth fighting for. Because in the end, that's what love is, isn't it? Not perfect. Not easy. But real. And for the first time in years, I felt ready to embrace it. The final piece of my journey home came a few months later, in the early days of spring. The snow had melted, leaving the yard muddy and dotted with patches of stubborn ice. Life in the farmhouse had settled into a new normal. Mom's health had stabilized, though she was still fragile, and Ashley and I had decided to alternate visits to ensure she was never alone. I had just returned from a long walk along the edge of the woods, my old favorite spot as a teenager, when Mom called me into the living room. She was sitting in her recliner, a wooden box balanced on her lap. I hadn't seen it in years, but I knew instantly what it was, the family memory box. Dad had built it when we were kids, filling it with photos, keepsakes, and little notes from all of us. It had been a staple of our childhood, something we'd forgotten about as the years went on. Sit with me, she said softly, patting the chair beside her. I sat, watching as she opened the box. Inside were faded Polaroids, crumpled ticket stubs, and yellowed letters. She picked up a photo and handed it to me, a picture of Dad, grinning as he held a toddler Ashley in one arm and a baby me in the other. His face was so full of joy, so alive, that it made my chest ache. "I've been thinking a lot about the past," Mom said, her voice quiet but steady. "About your father, and the choices we both made. And I've realized something." "What's that?" I asked, turning the photo over in my hands. "That love isn't about being perfect," she said, looking at me with watery eyes. "It's about showing up, even when it's hard. Even when it hurts. Your father wasn't perfect, and neither was I. But we tried. And I hope you and Ashley know how much we loved you, despite everything." I nodded, the words catching in my throat. "We know, Mom." We spent the rest of the afternoon going through the box, sharing stories and memories. For the first time, it felt like we weren't trying to hide from the past. We were facing it together, messy as it was, and finding beauty in the imperfections. When I finally left the farmhouse that spring, it wasn't with the bitterness I'd carried for so many years. It was with a sense of peace. I hugged Ashley tightly, promising to visit soon, and held Mom just a little longer, telling her how much I loved her. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, the farmhouse growing smaller in the distance. I realized then that it wasn't just the place that had changed, it was me. I had come back broken, weighed down by years of anger and grief. But I was leaving whole, with a heart that was finally open to forgiveness, to love, and to the imperfect beauty of family. The journey home hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And as I turned onto the highway, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and gold, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. For myself, for my family, and for whatever lay ahead.